there's no, ontological distinction, like, really
Mm-hmm.
between porn and erotica, and porn is, like, notoriously very hard to define, and, obscenity, I know it when I see it, and, like, I do think, like, the difference is much more contextual than content Yule.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
but partly I think like there are departures in these films from a lot of the conventions of like narrative porn, which was then by the early 70s was had started to become like a really defined and profitable genre, strict like escalation of sex acts and like quote unquote meat shots and money shots, obviously gendered conventions, but also just sort of filmic conventions
Mm.
for like the genre of like, adult film that are not being followed in these erotic sexual cinema verite pattern films
Mm-hmm.
because they're supposed to be more sort of documentary or observational.
There's almost like a violence of like narrative itself, like having a narrative scripted and put on a act or performance from a producer or a writer is kind of in a certain is shaping like the world making that sex implies, whereas these films seem to be in conversation with the actual participants themselves and their actual lived experience, or just observational and avant-garde way, which is
Yeah,
not trying to
exactly. There's
imply
like
some
not
kind of overarching.
imposition of a yeah narrative. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's very true.
That's cool.
Um,
Welcome to A Mute Manifesto, episode 36. I've got erstwhile coworker and good friend Lucy Talbot Allen on. Yeah, Lucy, can you introduce yourself real quick?
yeah. So I have an email job at a nonprofit film archive and theater in New York. And then I studied moving image archiving and preservation, got a master's about a year ago, and I do some freelance writing about film and film programming as well.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about your thesis, actually. It's called Real People Doing Real Stuff, The Past and Future of the National Sex Forum Films. Yeah, can you kind of introduce the topic and the content of it real quick?
Yeah, so I, as a grad student, interned at Vinegar Syndrome, which is people mainly know it as like a sort of boutique Blu-ray house and like distributor of, it's kind of like the Criterion collection of like schlock and porn and exploitation film. Um, they started out mainly focused like specifically on like golden age porn adult film, but they then sort of expanded to other kinds of like horror exploitation film genre stuff. They're based in Connecticut, and then in addition to having this like sort of distribution arm and they do all their restorations in house and they produce like Blu-rays and UHD DVDs. They also have like a substantial archive of which some of the stuff is not like or a majority is not actually for distribution. It's just sort of being kept there for safekeeping for various reasons. And one of the collections which I was working with when I interned there is this really expansive and kind of multifaceted collection belonging to somebody named Theodore McIlvenna, who was kind of known as Dr. Ted, who was a Methodist reverend and sort of sex positive activist who began working in San Francisco in the 60s and died in, I believe, 2016 or 2018. And he was sort of best known as the founder of this Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, which was a for profit and sort of minimally pseudo accredited sexology school in San Francisco that operated for several decades. But he both collected a huge amount of porn and both like film and video, and also a lot of erotic and art of other in other mediums, and also produced and distributed through various ventures that I'll get into his own sort of like sexually explicit film that was produced by him and directed by a number of collaborators and filmmakers. So I was doing a lot of processing of that collection, inspecting and repairing film, and identifying films, and recanning them and stuff, just the kind of basic processes of like ingestion in a film archive. And I found all that stuff really, really interesting and was learning about the history of it as I was working on it. And that led me to focus on that for my thesis for my master's degree, which was on specifically on this collection in general, but specifically and especially focused on these national films that were produced kind of under the aegis of the National Sex Forum, which was one of Dr. Ted's first ventures, and it was a production house for these basically like short experimental or sort of documentary, and I'll get more into genre later, but sex films.
Yeah. So we'll be kind of like covering this idea of like humanist sexology and these like this kind of like a little bit of the history of the production of it and the different people involved with it and how it does blur genres. It's not really porn, so to speak, but it is like sexually explicit, and there's some interesting contingencies that relate to potentially queer and disability kind of tangents as within this portrayal of sex and this archiving of people talking about and doing sex. But yeah, before we get into that, like I kind of was curious just to start out by asking you, because like film archiving is something that you're interested in general, is that correct? And I was kind of interested like why that's interesting to you. It's not just in finding gems that you can then screen. It's like the archiving itself is interesting. Is that fair to say?
I have sort of like my answer to the like why film archiving question, I think, is kind of like twofold, I'm realizing, which is like part of it is just film cinema as an art form and believing in like the importance of its preservation, and also like having this like kind of analog fetishism. I like working physically with film. I like repairing film and handling film, and I don't get to do it as much these days, but I like really enjoy just the materiality of it. And then the other aspect is, I think, a more like broad sort of characteristic about myself, which is just a kind of like anthropological sort of like voyeurism and like nostalgia of like wanting to connect with the past in as intimate a way as possible, and moving image and sort of like audiovisual media, hearing voices, seeing people in action, particularly in sort of observational or documentary forms, is kind of like the closest thing we get to time travel. And so I think like moving image documentation of history is like appealing to me, to my sense of sort of like Weltschmerz, or like, dissatisfaction with the present and desire to touch the past.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a pretty intimate form of it's a pretty intimate way to have that historicity. Like, I mean, you're working with like actual materials that other people worked with, and right, like the actual film strips and stuff.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of writing about sort of like this like archive fever thing, or like the kind of like fetishistic and like often like erotic, but just like kind of the excitement of like, having like physical contact with the past, kind of in archives in general, like not just film. But then I think the kind of documentary or like, observational characteristic and kind of voyeuristic character of film makes it even more so.
when it comes to like touching the past and like having it be in conversation with the present and the ongoing future, like I think it's probably a good segue into talking about the National Sex Forum, the NSF. So like, what exactly is that? Can you expand on that? And when did it come to be? And like, who is Dr. Ted and other essential characters who are foundational to its instantiation?
Yeah, so Dr. Ted was he was like born, his father was also a Methodist preacher who was like an itinerant preacher in like Native American communities, and by all accounts was like pretty sex positive for his time. Dr. Ted was born in the 30s, but he seems to have sort of like held these his kind of beliefs from an early age. But he studied theology at like various institutions that were often too conservative for him, and then he ultimately ended up in 1963 at Glide Methodist Church, which was a kind of famous. It's interesting. The thing with Dr. Ted is like there's a lot of like ways that his life touched kind of other people and organizations and kind of phenomena that are much more famous than him, and like very few people have heard of him. He doesn't have a Wikipedia page, but then like there's so many threads of his story that are like you know related to so many things that people do know about, and it's just kind of he's like a really interesting kind of character to follow at that level, even beyond his own work. But so he was a preacher at Glide, which was this church in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which is a neighborhood that, continues to be to a degree and has always been like kind of a hub for like sex work and like homeless youth. Like a lot of like queer and trans youth end up there, and especially did in the 60s and 70s. And so there was this kind of phenomenon of these like street outreach, from churches, and which was and continues to be like a tool for not always good to like
Mhm.
homeless youth, but
Like, so it's fair to say that like a lot of this outreach is kind of like the type of outreach to homeless or at-risk youth that has a larger intention behind it, where it's like you're trying to
yes,
convert
yes,
people or like
right, right,
forcibly kind of like change their lifestyle or something. But it seems like Dr.
right.
Ted was kind of intervening in that status quo, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he was sort of the first person to like bring together the homophile movement that was sort of like nascent at the time in the early 60s, and like these kind of progressive like religious groups. So like he hired Phyllis Lyon, who went on to form the Daughters of Bilitis, which was like the first lesbian activist organization, with her partner Del Martin, or she had founded it actually in 1955. So this was after that. He brought on her as to work with him at Glide as his assistant, and she also ended up working with him actually throughout his career. Is in some of the NSF films, and had an administrative role at the school that he founded. But he was like pretty active in like homophile organizing, though he by all accounts was straight, was married to a woman for most of his life. But he like brought together clergy members and homophile activists for this thing called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, in also the early 60s, that was like the first conference or initiative of any kind to like bring together gay activists and clergy members. They started with like a workshop and then formed this council on religion and the homosexual. Also, and then the council on religion and the homosexual hosted like a drag ball with sort of the intention of like exposing the hypocrisy and oppressive behavior of the cops in San Francisco. So they like made sure to observe the necessary codes and confirm that the cops wouldn't interfere. And then they hosted this ball, and then the cops still disrupted it. And so then they had like a press conference to sort of, draw attention to this phenomenon. And it was actually cited. I mean, this was 4 years before Stonewall, and it was cited as sort of a turning point in like San Francisco's queer activist history.
like a true like ally, like an actual
Yes.
like working actively to reveal not only the like issues of the queer community at the time, but also like the complicity of the status quo and in harming and disrupting queer thriving. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there's an interesting quote that I wanted to pull up from this guy Josh Sides, who's like a historian of wrote this book called Erotic City about San Francisco. That he says that the Council on Religion and Homosexual is one of the first organizations to argue that homosexuals represented not simply a socially marginalized but also an economically depressed group, because I think like a lot of his observations of queer people were like of people living on the street and in precarious situations, like directly because of their because of being kicked out by families. And this is pre-gay or sort of on the eve of gay liberation, so it's interesting that he was kind of so aware of that at the time. And then I think what is interesting is that then this like commitment to homophile burgeoning gay liberation movement kind of led him to see this kind of broader problem of anti-sexuality, or like kind of sex negativity in culture. And there's a quote. There's actually a really good Hustler interview with him from, I'm not sure, I can't remember the year, but where he says, while learning about gays and their problems, I found incredible ignorance and anti-sexual bias built into the institutions around us. So I think there's like the specificity of like what queer people were experiencing in the Tenderloin and in San Francisco generally opened up this realization that like sexuality in general was sort of punished and marginalized.
I like that like builds in a sense that this is a thing that everyone has stake in, right? It's not like just exclusive to queer people. Like it, by highlighting sexuality and in a healthy way, like that's something that interacts directly with queer liberation, but also like with all kind of general liberation.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and so in the process of this activism, he had also been sort of like collecting confiscated Stag films. There was also like very much, this was a moment in the like late 60s in San Francisco. And this was like before this kind of blew up in Times Square and before kind of the porno chic era was starting. There were all these kind of storefront, small sex movie houses. This was kind of, again, like before like feature length porn films, Deep Throat, etc., were like available or were being made at all. San Francisco was sort of like the ground zero for these like smaller movie houses that were showing like short sexually explicit films of various kinds, and they were often confiscated by the police on obscenity charges, and Dr. Ted would sort of collect them and show them in he actually was able to get a grant from the United Methodist Church's Board of Church and Society to like buy more sex films to show people, which is kind of incredible to imagine that he managed to do that.
That's
But
amazing.
yeah, but he would hold these sort of like seminars that were basically just to be like the way to teach people about sexuality and to rid people of their repression and bias is to just like show sex films. So he started doing that like in the basement of the Church of Glide Church, and that sort of was the seed of this initiative that was first called the National Sex and Drug Forum, and then kind of shifted its focus to just be about sex, and was called the National Sex Forum. And it was sort of co-founded with Phyllis Lyon from Daughters of Bilitis, this guy Laird Sutton, who was a fellow Methodist minister and a filmmaker, and made most of the films that the NSF produced, and then a few other like psychiatrists and clergy members. But the kind of the core of the group was Dr. Ted, Laird Sutton, and Phyllis Lyon.
Yeah. So it kind of started. Can you define like a stag film?
Yeah. So stags are like a predecessor to porn, basically. They were like as early as like the teens and 20s, like sort of unofficially kind of sub rosa like films of people having sex. There was no like official exhibition venues for them, so they were mostly shown in like at bachelor party. I mean, that's kind of where the term stag comes from, because like stag parties are
Mm-hmm.
another word for bachelor parties. And so they would be shown like kind of in these like homosocial like domestic environments often. And then with the expansion of like small gauge film, 16 millimeter film, 8 millimeter film, and the kind of increasing consumer accessibility of film starting in like the 40s, 50s, 60s, there started to be like many more kind of forms of sexually explicit film that people could access in slightly in more and more venues. And actually like starting in the 60s, there were these things called beaver films, which were basically usually just like one or two women just kind of like, they were kind of softcore. They were like, there was nudity, but there wasn't usually like sex or penetration. And those were often like what was being shown in these like storefront theaters in San Francisco that were kind of like the first like official or semi-official, the first like porn theaters that people were like, paying to go to, even though they were also kind of, of dubious legality at the time.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. But like, so like both stag films and like beaver films were kind of like male gazy, right? Like they were kind of like catered to like
Yeah.
straight male sexuality.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, partly just like as a matter of like who had the means of production. I mean, especially in
Mm-hmm.
like the Stag era, where it was like basically like these were films that had to be produced by like, people who worked in Hollywood, but were making them secretly, basically, because
Mm.
nobody else could access like, 35 millimeter
Right.
cameras. And then with the expansion of like small gauge film and like kind of underground film, that became accessible to a larger number of people, but still it was still extremely expensive. It was still a very limited number of people who were able to access filmmaking equipment. And so I think that's like part of it, but also just, replicating like gazes of other kinds of erotic art, that are more about sort of like teasing, like a sort of like, revealing the female body in a kind of, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
voyeuristic way, rather than like really being about sex per se.
Yeah. Or like actual pleasure being shown or anything
Yeah,
on the
more sort of
screen.
titillation, I guess, than like,
Right. Yeah. Okay.
and
So,
even like a lot of the early stags are more kind of like comedic almost, like than
uh-huh.
um than like for like arousal per se.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so like the NSF started by doing like by like showing these things, and there probably is something to be said about just the act of like curating a space for them in a certain way, in a certain intentional way, that probably yielded a different result than just kind of like catering to people who are looking for that titillation. But then it went from doing that to actually producing its own films, right?
Yeah, so I think in the process of like recontextualizing those films and having those sort of seminars, like Dr. Ted realized that there was this need for like a kind of sex film that did not exist yet. Uh,
Yeah, this might be a good time
it
to
was also
also just like
okay.
ask the question as well, like just to give you one more thing to answer, like the this idea of like humanist sexology. I don't know if that's something that he coined.
Yeah, so the term, I'm not sure who coined the term. It's sort of defined very like, she may have coined it, this scholar Janice Irvine, who's like a historian of sexuality. But she sort of defines it as being a form of sexology that emerges like in the 60s, sort of in opposition to the kind of more like scientific sexology of people like Masters and Johnson, who were kind of the preeminent sexologists at the time. I think Kinsey falls sort of somewhere in between in a way. I mean, he was, active in the 40s or 40s and earlier. And then I think this schism that Irvine identifies is like has to do with a division between people like William Masters and Virginia Johnson, who were like a married couple who were, very influential sexologists, but were working in a very kind of legitimizing sort of like scientific, what's the word I'm looking for, like positivist kind of mode
like
of
trying to
like, we're
declare,
studying this objectively.
right,
Yeah.
right, how sex works subjectively, right? Okay, yeah, sure.
Yes. And they were very actually opposed to like using film in like sexology because they thought it was sort of like, they didn't approve of its use as like an educational tool, because they found it too like, subjective.
Hmm.
But then so then this humanistic mode is like, very tied in with like 60s kind of the human potential movement, the Esalen Institute, like these kind of, hippie beginnings of kind of woo-woo like modes of thought and life of like, experiential, like highlighting kind of like being in your body and like, be-ins and like not intellectualizing things, but like experiencing sexuality and prioritizing experience over kind of theory, I guess,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
to put it simply. But like, yeah, and I'll just quote from Irvine, Janice Irvine. She says that like this like human potential movement and humanistic sexology, the vehicle was experiential exercises. The focus was on knowing by doing, a rebellion against the positivist rationality embodied in scientific and academic thought.
Mm.
Um, so anyway, so that is sort of Dr. Ted, the NSF were kind of these they, along with also this like Center for Marital and Sexual Studies, which was based in Long Beach around the same time, and also produced films, were kind of like the exemplary like figures in humanistic sexology.
Yeah, so like that's kind of, yeah, so that's kind of like a frame that you can understand as we get into how the NSF started to actually produce these types of sex films that were previously not existing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there was like a desire to like make films that expressed kind of like how people actually have sex, how people actually think about sex, that were like not scripted or kind of like prescriptive. So like a lot of the films were what McElvenna and Laird Sutton, the main filmmaker, called pattern films. And so they were supposed to like depict like a couple's sexual pattern, usually a couple, sometimes an individual, sometimes like a group of people. The sexual pattern referring to like, the progression of sex that they just like usually have, like what their sex life looks like unobserved, like how, they, foreplay, like how sex progresses for them in a kind of like way that is not prescribed by like how sex is like meant to progress, like basically highlighting the idea that like, sexual patterns are like different for everyone, and that like individuals and couples like find their own ways of doing things.
Hmm.
um so a lot of them were these like, sexual cinema verite pattern films that were actually like depicting people having sex. I mean, straight couples, gay couples, lesbian couples. And then within that, like there were a number of films. There was like a kind of a whole series of films in a way, like this was a major focus for them, of couples where one person, usually the man, and I mean, usually, oh, I think they were all straight couples in this case, is physically disabled. So like a lot of films about how couples where one member is like a wheelchair user or has like a spinal cord injury, what they are able to do sexually, what they like want to do sexually, how things are different and the same for them. But anyway, so there, all of those are these like pattern films, and then there are also, the NSF also produced films, like sort of more discussion based films that didn't necessarily have explicit sex in them, but had groups of gay men or lesbians or groups of disabled people like talking about, various aspects of their sex lives politically and socially and sort of emotionally. And we're often just kind of like sitting around in a circle, like talking in this casual mode. And so those are kind of the two like main subtypes of the NSF films. But then the NSF was like a year or two later supplemented by this distribution arm called the Multimedia Resource Center. And they would under that title, would distribute both NSF films and films made by other like independent filmmakers, most of them Bay Area based, that were like, broadly fell under this same umbrella of like humanistic sex film, but were often more experimental in form and notable. And again, this is another instance where like Dr. Ted kind of like crosses paths with these people who are better known in other contexts, like filmmakers like James Broughton, Barbara Hammer, Jerry Abrams, Gunvor Nelson, who are all like pretty big names in within the realm of like
Yeah.
experimental film, who had very much had, we're distributing films through various organizations and cooperatives and stuff, but the MMRC was one of them, and they were sort of recontextualized by being placed in the context of like sex education. So like a film that
Yeah.
would be classified as, like James Broughton made all these films. He was like he has an incredible career. He like was making films from like the 40s or 50s up until like the 90s, and he spanned a lot of different kind of modes and eras of experimental film. But he was kind of a radical fairy adjacent, and like was like a poet and a sort of spiritual filmmaker, and like made a lot of work that was like sort of celebrating the body, and kind of almost like Walt Whitman-esque or something. Not something that most people would consider sex education films, but they're films about like sexuality and sensuality and spirituality in the body. And like by placing them in this catalog that was for distribution to essentially like schools and church groups and stuff, that were, that were also sex positive, there was kind of like a reinscription of these like experimental films as part and parcel of like sex education, or like preparation for sex counselors and sexologists.
You get into in your essay, you get into this thing about how like the genre categorization of a collection or of a film actually matters quite a bit in how it's thought about, archived, and distributed, and how this collection straddles like several different genres and is kind of an liminal generic category. Can you get into that a little bit? It's like maybe part of this idea of like contextualizing film, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think like the films produced by the NSF were kind of like, you might call them sort of like cinema verite, or kind of like almost like ethnographic, observational documentary film, but they also did often like use certain hallmarks of like kind of that era's like avant-garde and experimental film. So like sort of double exposure and cross-cutting and close-ups that are sort of like have an abstract effect. And then even just sort of like stylistically, like the music is often like sort of folky, like guitar music, and there's all these sort of like hallmarks of like the counterculture kind of, and like the people in the films are clearly like San Francisco hippies of the era, but then also there is like sex happening on screen, and so they are evoking or sort of like acknowledging the porosity of the border between porn and other forms of other genres. But Dr. Ted was very like hated the terms porn and smut, and like did not want them, like very strongly did not want them applied to these films. And he preferred, as a general rule, used the term erotic folk art to describe like all of the work that he like collected and distributed.
That's cool.
Yeah, but there was like in making these films, there was like a very like clear and strict understanding among the participants that they were for educational purposes, and that I mean, education could include like arousal. It wasn't like you need to watch these like with your
With their hands
hands
on the
politely
table.
folded. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
exactly. but like but it was like the education was supposed to be experiential and like
Mm.
embodied and like gestalt and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there is a really interesting question about like how the conversation with participants happened that I want to get into. But like
Mhm.
kind of also though, I do think that this like distinction between like porn and like erotic art and like educational material is really interesting. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like the way that the films that were acquired or produced by the NSF used form and framing to create a more like erotic effect as opposed to a more pornographic effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like there's no, ontological distinction like really
Mm-hmm.
between porn and erotica, and porn is like notoriously very hard to define, and obscenity, I know it when I see it, and like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's, I do think like the difference is much more contextual than content
Mm,
mule.
mm-hmm.
uh
Yeah.
but I think like partly I think like there are departures in these films from a lot of the conventions of like narrative porn, which was then by the early 70s was had started to become like a really defined and profitable genre, that had its own, industry, and had its own like formal and generic conventions of like a sort of strict like escalation of sex acts, and like the things that like Linda Williams, who wrote Hardcore, which is like a, kind of the first like major like cinema studies text about porn, writes about, of like quote unquote meat shots and money shots, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
a focus on like ejaculation and like genitals. She has a lot of like specific arguments about like how female pleasure is portrayed in straight porn and stuff, that are both like gendered conventions but also just sort of filmic conventions,
Mm.
for like the genre of like the adult film, that are not being followed in these erotic sexual cinema verite pattern films,
Mm-hmm.
because they're supposed to be more sort of documentary or observational.
Yeah.
um,
Just as a
and I think
quick
it's interesting, like, yeah, no, go ahead.
yeah, sorry, I just as like a quick tangent, like I just it's coming up for me like this interesting thing of like, not to be, I don't know, whatever, but there's almost like a violence of like narrative itself. Like having a narrative scripted and put on a act or performance from a producer or a writer is kind of in a certain is shaping like the world making that sex implies, whereas these films seem to be in conversation with the actual participants themselves and their actual lived experience, or just observational and avant-garde way, which is
Yeah,
not trying to
exactly. There's
imply
like
some
not
kind of overarching.
imposition of a yeah narrative. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's very true.
That's cool.
Um, and then I think another sort of contextual factor is just that like there was a lot of slippage, especially in the early, especially like before kind of the porno chic era of the 70s, before the like cementing of like adult film as a genre, where like there was kind of like a slippage between like underground film, avant-garde film, and sort of just like sex film generally, where like I mean a lot of like very like seminal like avant-garde films like the like Jack Smith's films like Flaming Creatures were like the subject of at the heart of these like obscenity trials in the 60s. And so they, even though like that Flaming Creatures is not like a especially sexually explicit film, especially compared to like a lot of the work that would come out like in starting in the late 60s and 70s, but because it was sort of at the heart of these like struggles over obscenity, there kind of came to be this like link between underground filmmaking, independent filmmaking, and sex film, such that like underground film almost came to be kind of like a shibboleth for like sex film. Yeah, in the context of these 16 millimeters, and then there's also like this relationship with format here specifically, where like 16 millimeter film was very much associated with the avant-garde and experimental filmmaking in the 60s, and then it was also, because it was this cheaper format, associated with like the beaver films and like, you know, early porn basically in the 60s. And so the fact of this like format that kind of united them as all these forms of kind of like independent underground, you know, marginal filmmaking. I think it's really interesting. Andy Warhol's Blue movie, which was, let me actually look up what year that was. Uh 60, I feel like 65, I want to say, or no, it's later actually, 69. That was the first like quote unquote like hardcore film that received like theatrical distribution in like, you know, real theaters, like beyond these sort of like storefront kind of places. And that is like an extraordinarily experimental movie formally that is like totally observational and durational. It's just it's in a way very similar to like a lot of what Dr. Ted was making, or you know, was producing, of like it's just like a couple like having sex and then just kind of like talking and hanging out naked for like 3 hours, you know. And the fact that that is sort of like credited with launching kind of porno chic is really interesting, because it's so formally different from like the kinds of films that would come to be like kind of characteristic of that era, like Deep Throat, Debbie Does Dallas, whatever.
Yeah.
But it kind of speaks to like the really deep-seated relationship at that time between underground film and sex film.
Yeah, it's like being forced underground. The sexually explicit film, like the 16 millimeter, became the means through which you could produce it kind of without a bunch of resources, and you know that happens underground. And then like what else is happening underground? Well, it's like avant-garde stuff that is on the outskirts of like culture to begin with, that also like doesn't have a bunch of resources and stuff. But then it takes someone like Andy Warhol, this big like, you know, star or whatever, to kind of bring it into a larger sphere that then transmutes into the more what we would call pornographic. So it's not like there's a existential difference between them so much, but there's kind of this circumstantial affiliation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that it's fair to say, like, when I say the pornographic with almost a disparaging tone, and when Dr. Ted maybe does the same thing, he's like, oh, this isn't like smut or whatever. It's okay to maybe like deconstruct that and be like, well, it could be smut and also be good, right?
Exactly.
But I do think that there's something about like the intention and the sense of it being like erotic in a sense that is a little bit different than the kind of like pornographic kind of dissociated, intense and narrative production that we might by default associate with the pornographic today.
Yeah, well, and I think I want to talk briefly here about SAR, sexual attitude reassessment. Sometimes it was said to stand for sexual attitude reconstruction, but it's like this process that was developed by Dr. Ted and his collaborators, and that is still used actually in a modified form in like training of like or AA-SECT certification, which is the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. In its early form, it was like a multi-day session of like just watching a ton of sexually explicit media, mostly like film, and then also like slide films, like slideshows of various kinds, both commercially produced porn and NSF observational and sex educational films. SAR was in a way kind of developed to teach people the distinction between, this is a quote from, I actually don't know how to pronounce her first name, Anya, maybe? Eithne, I think it's an Irish name. Anyway, Johnson. She wrote this really interesting master's thesis and then does not seem to have gone on to become an academic but anyway, she writes that the SAR was designed to teach audiences how to distinguish between erotic and pornographic audiovisual materials, which sort of suggests that that definition isn't self-evident and like kind of needs to be shown to people. And yet it also suggests that like there is this distinction that exists that can like be demonstrated by juxtaposing these two kinds of film. There was kind of this distinction built into the kind of architecture of like how these films were being seen, because the NSF films were like partly being produced to be shown in the context of SAR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, not to dwell on this too much or whatever, but like, I think that there is like, that is pretty interesting to me. Like, that's pretty compelling because I think that there is potential like harm that comes out of ingesting produced commercial porn and assuming that that is like real sex in a, once again, not to say that it isn't always, you can deconstruct these categories, but there's something there. And I think that there is potentially, you know, especially in today's world where it's so readily accessible to like any adolescent, like, and it's so ubiquitous, the pornographic, like it's not even, you can have the pornographic without it even being sexually explicit, I think. Like, yeah. There's a way that there's a production of what you believe to be the consensus or the norm with sex that can lead to quite a bit of harm or a lack of embodied pleasure. So I feel like I do like the idea of contrasting that form with a different presentation of sex.
Yeah, and I think that like probably for the people who participated in it who were like could either like sign up just for these like SAR seminars, or then later on were like students in the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality who like had the SAR as part of their coursework. There's probably a degree to which people could kind of draw their own conclusions and like watch these films and be like, actually, I don't know that there is such a profound difference, but also, you know, be exposed to what the differences might be.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Not to dogmatically impose some kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Being concerned about the ethics of sexuality and sexually explicit stuff, I want to return to this question of like Phyllis Lyon or Laird Sutton, like actually directing these films. How did the conversation work with the participants during and before and after the filming of the things? Like, what was that relationship like? Because it's such an intimate portrayal and such an intimate thing to be like, be in a pattern film would be kind of so intimate. So like, how did they find people for this, and like what were the conversations like to prime them for this production, these productions?
Yes. I'm hunting down a quote, that's why I'm not making eye contact with you.
Yeah, take your time.
Oh, here we go. So this is a quote from brochure, like a National Sex Forum brochure. Actors are not used in these films. The participants are ordinary people behaving and responding sexually as they usually do. The participants know that these films are being made for therapeutic, educational, research purposes and agree to the uses of the film. The persons are to be filmed are interviewed about their sexual patterns. Once sexual activity commences, no directions are given. Every effort is made to allow the individuals to feel at ease. And then after a film was shot, there would be like a rough cut shown to the participants who could then have sort of final veto power and any edits that they wanted to make. And in fact, I don't really know where the raw footage ended up for this. And this is sort of another like bigger archival and ethical question of what to do if this was ever found. But there were like probably at least a few dozen films that were shot, pattern films that were shot and then never actually completed and distributed because the participants ultimately vetoed them for whatever reason.
Right.
So there was like, you know, a sense and an agreement like by the people depicted in the film that like the ultimate decision about what the film looked like lay with them, despite the director nominally being
Yeah.
pretty much all the pattern films were directed by Laird Sutton. There was another filmmaker, Connie Beeson, who her films were like a little bit more experimental, but also kind of patterny, who was one of the other people sort of like producing things for the NSF. And then most of the other work was distributed, but not produced by them.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a real care that happened in making sure that the people participating were comfortable, and having that question of being able to after the fact veto it probably enables you to be a lot safe, like feel a lot safer and freer in like showing your actual pattern. But by the same token, like if your actual pattern is something that you might be self-conscious about or isn't has contradictions with the way that you see yourself or your sexuality, then there is something kind of contradictory about or paradoxical about the fact that those might be some of the most interesting documents and but they're not consenting to their distribution.
Yeah, no, it's true. And like also it's just like the presence of the camera is always going to change things to some degree.
Absolutely.
And so,
right.
There's no, truly objective, depiction of anyone on camera because they know that they're being filmed.
Which is kind of interesting because that's kind of, unless you're doing solo sex, like that is kind of like also like one of the conditions that's so interesting about sex, and maybe that's so scary about intimacy to begin with, is like there is that's always true. Another person. No. And it's like, but anyway, like this kind of care that that happens, because like ideally like intimacy is a situation where there's care occurring, right? And between the two people who are, or the several, whatever people are doing the acts, but then also like there was care taken to in the production of it and in the framing of it and the allowing somebody to withhold their consent after the fact with the distribution. But there's also this moment of care, I think, that you even like referenced directly, like in your thesis, as you said, like touching the past in this way, like as someone who like comes into contact with this archive. And I know that you're actually showing one of these films in October, but so like, can you talk about the questions, the ethical questions and care that you've taken with like, what do you do with this collection exactly? And like, how does that care extend to the present as you interact with the past?
Yeah. So, and this was something that like was stressed by like the people at Vinegar Syndrome and stuff, like there is a sort of permissions and copyright like agreement that like these films can't be shown quote unquote commercially. How that exactly is defined is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to be showing a series of them in October at Anthology Film Archives where I work. And Anthology is a nonprofit and we charge admission, but it's pretty low and it's all going back to the organization. So the Vinegar Syndrome people agreed that would be in line with the desires of Dr. Ted and his widow, who willed the collection to Vinegar Syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, there is like there was an understanding when these films were made, like there was not going to be, obviously there was not the internet and they were not going to be distributed that way, but they were quite broadly distributed. I mean, many prints were made of these films. They were, they have ended up in the collections, though often kind of not identified as such, or like, so there will be like university archives or like hospital archives all over the country that have a National Sex Forum or Multimedia Resource Center film in their collections, and they may not know the context of those films or like how they ended up there, but they were distributed, they were sold and rented to universities and organizations all over the country during their, contemporaneously to when they were produced. And so the people appearing in them knew that, strangers are going to see these, that there's limited control that they would ultimately have over who exactly was going to see them. They were all going to be people who were seeing them in the context that they were made for, but they were being published. And so I think that like a lot of people I spoke to about this in writing the thesis agreed, and I agree that I don't think that these should be like freely disseminated online, because I think that that's too unwieldy and too distant from the sort of understanding of an awareness of the distribution of these films that the participants would have had at the time. And I think a significant, probably a majority of the people appearing in these films are probably no longer alive, because they were all like at least in their 20s I mean, plenty of them could still be alive, but they were all at least in their 20s in the 70s. A lot of them were gay and bisexual men, and this was before AIDS. A lot of them were also older. I mean, there was sort of a focus in a number of the films on like older people's sexuality. And so a lot of the people were like in their 50s or 60s, which is kind of funny to think of 50s and 60s as being like old. That doesn't really sound old to me anymore.
Right.
But in any case, a lot of these people are no longer with us. A lot of them, most of them were identified by first name, if at all. Tracking down, these people and their feelings about showing the films today would be very, very difficult, and I was not for lack of trying. But in any case, yes, I think that like online distribution is too unwieldy. I think that showing them again in essentially the same context that they were intended for, of like, where we're explaining what they were made for, why they were made, what people were trying to get out of them at the time, and then showing them again in public where people can experience them together, I think is, in line with the desires of both Dr. Ted and the participants in the individual films.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing the same kind of curating a space and like putting them in contact with this. Will you be also presenting them and like discussing them?
Yeah, I'll be introing them, and
that's really, that does feel very in line with like the original intention, and it is a beautiful way to like allow it to continue to impact us, right? Yeah, so can you get into some of the films that you'll be able to show? Like, can you get into like, can you kind of like give us a peer behind the veil of like what's actually in the content of some of these films and the ones that you are going to be able to actually like show?
I will just shamelessly sort of like plug my own event and also use that as like a frame to talk about.
Yeah, please do.
Individual ones, but two of the programs that I'm showing are going to like consist entirely of pattern films, or almost entirely of pattern films, and then they're going to be introduced with, or like before the pattern films for each of these programs, there's going to be one film from the humor and mood alteration section of the MMRC catalog, which would those would be films that would be sort of meant to be kind of like palate cleansers, or kind of like dispel people's sort of like discomfort a little bit in the midst of these like SAR sessions. So like there's one called Love Toad that is just like a 2-minute short of stop motion short of like beanbags having sex to the tune of what's the song, Je t'aime moi non plus. And then there's another one called Titles Available, that's just like a guy reading off the names of pornographic paperbacks that are at a local bookstore. And so these are these kind of like more like lighthearted films that are supposed to, I don't know, prepare the audience to see like more candid films of people having sex. And then I'm also going to be showing like a program of sort of gay liberation focused films and a program of women's liberation focused films. And those are going to both incorporate both things from the NSF and Multimedia Resource Center, and then other contemporary films, contemporary to that time, that sort of feel like they're in line with the ethos of those collections. And especially with those two programs, like I'm highlighting the kind of like more agitprop-y elements of their catalog. So like there were a few films that were like produced by the NSF that were like kind of gay liberation, discussions between gay men and lesbians and bisexuals, like just kind of like talking, like politicizing their own lives in these kind of like consciousness raising like circles. And there's a really interesting film called Hookers that's about Coyote, which was and Margot St. James, who was a like sex worker advocate and like union organizer. And it's sort of like just like a portrait of her and like a depiction of like like sex workers in San Francisco and their community and organizing efforts. So there was a lot of like there was an understanding of like political action as also a part of kind of like sex education and a part of like human sexuality as a holistic thing. And then I'm going to be showing a program of like disability films. So some of them are pattern films, and then one of them is more of just like a discussion between disabled people about sex. But yeah, and the opening program is going to be it's called like Confessions in Sex Histories, and it's going to have a film that I just find really interesting as a document that is of Wardell Pomeroy, who was like a protege of and collaborator with Kinsey, who then after Kinsey's death moved to San Francisco and got involved with the Institute. And it's him just conducting a sex history, which was basically just like a questionnaire of he's speaking to a woman named Janice Epp, who was also had an administrative role at the school, and he's just like interviewing her about her sex history. But it's like a practice that was like he conducted hundreds of these as a student or as a like while working with Kinsey, and so this is, as far as I know, the only audiovisual document of one of these like Kinseyan sex histories like being conducted. So it's kind of an interesting document. But yeah.
So like when exactly are these screenings, and like how can people go to attend them?
They are going to go from October 16th to 20th. They're at Anthology Film Archives in New York. General admission tickets are $14, $10 students and seniors. Hit me up if you want a discount. I can probably get you one because I work at the membership desk.
That's super. Yeah. That's super exciting. That'd be super cool to go. I wish I was in New York.
Yeah.
Okay, but before we close, I want to, in your conclusion of your thesis, you actually like go in a little bit about the rhyme with today's political oppression and the like Reaganite era that the NSF kind of emerged out of. And you talk about the kind of like you kind of make material and visible the like stakes of this kind of work as we like march onwards into a bleak kind of reality. Can you kind of speak on that here as well?
Yeah, well, I think what I said in the conclusion, and I think this is true, is that like we're obviously like facing a very archives and sort of cultural heritage organizations are facing like a very unprecedented kind of degree of
defunding
from
oppression,
and oppression and persecution by the U.S. government currently. But I think that like collection like organizations of various kinds that work with sexually explicit material are kind of uniquely poised to deal with this kind of thing, because for a lot of these organizations and organizations working with these collections, like they never had much institutional support to begin with. And like for the last like 20 years of his life, Dr. Ted was like looking for an archive to like, take his collection of like all of the erotic and pornographic media that he had collected, and like couldn't find a home for it because nobody wanted to take on the responsibility of that kind of material. And he was able to deposit a lot of the film at Vinegar Syndrome, but a lot of it has also ended up in various places, storage units in San Francisco that are still sort of being discovered. And so I think like he ran the Institute as a for-profit endeavor, which is not ideal in my view, but it's like that enabled him to basically like produce and collect all this stuff that probably would have had a lot of difficulty getting institutional funding otherwise. And I mean, Vinegar Syndrome is also a for-profit company, but it actually exercises like a very their archive is very professionally maintained with regard to like the standards of the field and everything. And that's not always the case for for-profit companies, and often like the kind of responsibility for preserving sexually explicit material has like come down to for-profit companies that that are about making money, and so they're not necessarily valuing like the highest standards of preservation and archiving. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, because it also means that like those places are less vulnerable to institutional funding cuts. So anyway, I just think like there's a kind of there's multiple things at play with regard to like how collections of sexually explicit, cultural heritage are able to cope with persecution.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that it's really important to have these conversations with the past ongoing, and sex is like such an important like reality that really needs this kind of public conversation and public not discourse, but public, experience, and I guess dialogue, right? And so I think it's really cool to be championing that and finding ways for that to continue in an ongoing way. Yeah, it's a really cool project. It's been really compelling and fun and interesting, like learning about it. And thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Where can people like find you, if anywhere, or if they'd like to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, Talbot Allen, TalbotAllen, and you can email me, Lucy Talbot Allen, LucyTalbotAllen @gmail.com.
And October 16th through 20th is the screenings.
Come to Anthology Film Archives, October 16th to 20th, and see some fun stuff.
Hell yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The mutant spirit still lives among us. There should be no attempt to fix us, our destiny to be unleashed. No clip from reality with friends. Seek reflections breathing or un. Feel with them and refuse refuge's refusal. Record before flight. And when you plummet back to the mud, how does it feel to dissolve, decay with me? Like the process of radioactive decay in unstable atoms, degeneration yields a more sustainable future. Destruction wages her war to lay with creation. What if the interval of eros is not reducible to deprivation, but is the rhythmic condition of aliveness itself? The children kneel in dust and send it humming into motion. The monstrous vermin scatter. Kafka's philosopher runs breathlessly after the top. Already he reaches for it. Already he wants to still the blur into something graspable, to close his fist around the bright little vertigo. Yet delight lives in the spinning itself. The moment the top stops dancing, it becomes only the idea of play. His curiosity remains dissatisfied as the monsters again gather around him, their many legs scratching at the root of his eye, or was it his groin, or inside his navel? He scarcely has time to pinpoint their location amidst the frenzied shadows. The Greeks call eros lack, yet the experiential texture of eros as it undulates across my body resists the simplicity of deprivation. When I am within the passion of love, I do not rest. My body trembles, melts, loses coherence. Sensation multiplies. My will becomes increasingly animated by the distance between myself and what I want to be as a lover. My spirit flushes and yearns to be as like God. Let there be light. Create. I am. Creator. My desire does not merely impoverish me. It heightens my perception, for the poor shall inherit the kingdom on earth, and in rebellion I will disorder the stillness. I love it when Sappho's tongue breaks. Thin fire moves beneath her skin. Her senses lose their ordinary hierarchy. Sight, sound, touch, heat, motion begin spilling into one another. I am so full. The cicadas terrify me. They sing themselves outside history. They no longer hunger. They no longer wait. They no longer suffer the humiliation of distance. They pop out of the ground and they sing, they sing, they sing. What an ecstasy. The song feels sacred, so nothing interrupts it. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing interprets it. Nothing reaches them anymore. They can't be bothered to stop singing. Their little bodies become sealed cathedrals of sound. After 3 days of forgetting to eat, they pass away, still singing. A teenager from Asheville will collect their bodies from the ground and attach their wings to jewelry she sells on Etsy. Their humming will underlay the soundtrack of a Somerset film, like a painted drop cloth on a studio backlot. At least they were never hungry. The heart understands long before philosophy does. It contracts, it releases, it contracts again. A pause lives inside every proof of life. When I flatline, does life disappear, or only the interval through which I learn to move through it? I can't make a sound unless there is inhale, exhale. If I cannot make a sound, surely the screaming will turn itself inside out and eat me for breakfast. It is only in the interval I am given strength to beat my chest, cries of pride. I exist perhaps as something holy, only through time, keeping rhythm to mark my duration. Infinity is eternal recurrence. Every living thing I have ever loved moves by meeting in the corner spaces where inside-outside meet. Tides, lungs, language, grief, migration patterns, menstrual blood, sleep. Even stars survive by tearing themselves apart. I think this is why lovers touch each other with such terror. The touch requires two surfaces, remaining strange to one another. Repetition, difference. Repetition, difference. Repetition, difference. Dissatisfied when the top stops humming, alienated from my own pleasures once it's secured in my back pocket. Let them keep spinning. I'm curious, so the skin must continue translating.